One. Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 FM, as well as YouTube. I am your host, Olga Peters, and I would like to welcome to the show regular contributor Emilie, as well as our guest, Senator Becca Balint for Windham County. Hello, Becca.
Good morning.
I feel like I haven't seen you forever. I'm sure Emilie has seen you with work days and such, but it's good to see you after many, many weeks.
Yes, nice to see you as well.
So I want to start with an issue that Becca brought to my attention. I admit sometimes I'm so in the Windham County bubble for the Commons that I forget about other things. And this was about stockpiling resources, which I think we're kind of familiar with, but you talk specifically about certain types of medications.
Yes.
So could you tell us about that, Becca?
Sure. So yesterday I got a rather distressing email from a constituent who has rheumatoid arthritis, and she was contacting me because the medicine that she's been on for many, many years that helps to treat her symptoms is no longer available. And she went to this is a common drug, make sure I get the name right, it's hydroxychloroquine. And it's used for rheumatoid arthritis, it's used for malaria, it's used for lupus, and so a lot of autoimmune issues. And she went to get the prescription from her doctor and then went to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist here in town said, "I can't get it for you anymore." And she said, "What are you talking about? Why can't you fill my prescription like you always do?" And he said that the Trump administration was stockpiling it because there was, and I don't use this word lightly, that there is a rumor that it might actually be helpful in alleviating some symptoms from COVID-19. There is no evidence of this. There are no peer-reviewed tests. There are, in fact, no tests at all. It is just anecdotal evidence that it might in some people offer some kind of relief, and it has never been shown to actually be effective. But so now you've got the Trump administration stockpiling millions of these pills to the detriment of our constituents here and people all over the nation that deal with these issues. And it was so frustrating for me to be able to tell her, first of all, I, as a state senator, can't do anything, but I can put you in touch with our federal delegation. And so I put her right in touch with somebody from Senator Leahy's office who's on it and trying to help her. But in talking with this woman from Leahy's office, there are people all over Vermont who are in the same situation. And I feel like the news is missing this critical piece that, you've got plenty of people writing op-eds about how you've got Trump constantly chasing these unicorns, like there's going to be some kind of magic bullet. But when we bring it down to actual individuals, this is what it means when you have somebody at the top who is incompetent and doesn't think carefully about how it affects real people on the ground. So it's really sad and it's really frustrating.
Do we know, Becca, if it sounds like there's other autoimmune related medication that's being stockpiled as well?
They're medications that are in the same family as this one that I mentioned. And so I believe the Trump administration is stockpiling two specifically, and it's the ones that are the most frequently prescribed for these particular conditions. And so I think we're seeing so profoundly what it means to have someone who doesn't believe in science, who doesn't trust the experts, who believes that there is just showmanship. That is all that Americans care about, and we'll just get through on showmanship and ratings for his press conferences. And I think we sometimes get so caught up in the farce of it that we forget it's actually impacting real people on the ground. And his talking point for the last week and a half on this issue was, what do we have to lose? Why aren't we trying this? What do we have to lose? And what we have to lose is the health of people here that we know, our neighbors, our family members who can't get these medications. And it's absolutely a travesty of justice. It really is.
And what we talked about last week was the federal administration's reneging on a responsibility regarding, distribution of supplies. And this is another way that basically the hoarding of supplies is affecting people's day-to-day life and ability to maintain their health. And if I think about it on the global scale, these medications start as malaria medications and have increasingly been used towards other autoimmune diseases. But if we look at the impacts on the global south, where people are taking these malaria medications regularly in order to prevent chronic diseases, that's enormous. And starting to hear conversations about, if we are going to test for COVID medications, that those tests seem to be guided towards the global south as well as sort of, the next round in generations of using those countries for medical testing. And that's, also very scary.
So I want to bring this back because this is just me personally. I hate feeling helpless. And so I'm always like, what can I do? So it brings me back to this relationship between the states and the federal government, which I think are being really tested right now, mainly for all the reasons you mentioned, Becca. But, when I was talking to Meg Mott for another article recently, we went into depth about the state's original duty and to protect. And she calls it the duty to protect. Some people call it the policing authority. But in our breakdown of federal versus state powers, the state's first primary duty, as far as Meg Mott's concerned, constitutionally, is protecting its people. So since something that the federal government is doing right now is not protecting people on a state level, whether it's hoarding the medications or hoarding masks, or I guess I should use the proper word, stockpiling, to be.
Oh, it's
polite.
hoarding. Call it what it really is. It makes things simpler, Olga. It's hoarding.
We were wondering where all our toilet paper was. It's actually in Florida at Mar-a-Lago, right? So does that give states more power to say to the government, look, we need to protect our people, cough the stuff up, get it out here, get it to New York, get it to Vermont, get it to wherever it's needed?
Well, I'm gonna let me take that and then I'll jump in.
Okay.
Thanks, Becca. We don't have the power to really do that. So we can, yell and write letters, right, to the president. And we've been doing that about a wide variety of things, sometimes more effectively than others. What I do see happening that I think has been happening slowly for a long time is the state sort of taking responsibilities to come together on their own. So, we see California shipping hospital equipment to New York and sort of leaving the federal government's distribution pathways out of that. And I think that's highlights a process that's been happening where we sort of are passing a series of legislation on the state level over the last few years to really say, can we build capacity here and to ignore what's happening on the federal level? And so I see us doing that much more practically now. If we lived in a state that perhaps was producing a lot of pharmaceuticals, I think perhaps we would have greater control there. But Vermont is deeply connected to all of the other places. What do you think, Becca?
So I think Emilie brings up a good point, as our choices are limited. And so we have seen in the last few weeks some incredible leadership from the states. And although it's heartening, I think with every statement that a governor makes that is showing leadership, it is showing currently the irrelevance of the federal government and its ability to lead right now because of who is in that position and who he's surrounded himself with. And that is a very sad condition we find ourselves in. I want to give a very explicit bit of praise to our governor. Despite the fact that we are of different parties, he and his administration have been completely and totally tied to science and advisors who know what they're talking about and who he's listening to, and he's following their lead. And last week, when it was clear that the Trump administration was not using its federal authority to dictate that companies start producing more N95 masks and more ventilators. I reached out to the governor privately through his team to say, would you, as a Republican governor, make a statement calling on the Trump administration to use this authority? And he did. Governor Scott did. And it's easy for a Democratic governor to do that. It's not as easy for a Republican governor to do that, because he doesn't want to lose his channels to be able to get what he needs, and I think that's what's been so pitiful to watch, is governors like Cuomo in New York and the governor of Michigan feeling like they're competing with each other to get what they need. And then you have somebody like Jared Kushner saying, oh, well, the national stockpile is not actually for the states. The national stockpile is for the federal government, which really, it exists to serve the states.
What is the federal
Makes no
government
sense.
not to serve the states, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just how big did your head explode when that statement was made?
I have no head left. No, it's just a little nubbin. This is actually a paper mache mask covering up.
My forehead is complete. See, if I was to turn a profile, I would have none, because I've been banging my head on the desk for weeks now.
And so I think we as legislators have to look to each other and to other people in state governments across this nation who are really showing what it is to lead. And there have been so many dark times the last few weeks, and so many really funny times. I don't know if you heard, Olga, John Dillon from VPR did a piece a couple weeks ago where he pieced together all these snippets of conference calls. Did you see it?
I did not see that.
You didn't?
No, it sounds very
it's a treasure.
Fun. It's a treasure. And so I was thinking about our learning arc. So when we first tried to legislate in a different way through this crisis, the level of incompetence just on using mute and unmute functions, is astounding. And then I thought about how, in about a half hour, we're going to go live doing our first round of remote voting in the Senate, and how much people have really stepped up. They've figured out, like, we have to do this. The federal government is not it's not some entity that's going to be able to show leadership at this time. So we have to do it. And it's terrifying. And it's also really beautiful at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So before we go on, I do want to check in with Emilie, see if there's anything she wants to add. But before we do that, I'm still thinking about people who are not getting the medication they need. While Leahy's office is working on trying to get that particular medication released, do these folks have backup medications? I mean, that they can afford, that they have access to, that works on their condition?
So I'll be following up with this constituent this morning, but the way that we left it yesterday was, I don't have my medication, and I've been told I'm not going to get it. And so all the symptoms that she's been able to control for years now, right, it's increasing her anxiety to think about those symptoms coming back, but also that's not what we need in a time of healthcare crisis, to have people not managing their symptoms so that we can keep them healthy and out of a hospital where they might be exposed to other things like COVID-19, for example. And, Emilie and I are coming off of a 24-hour cycle when a former House member, someone that I knew and loved, died from COVID-19. And so it's hit home for me very, very strongly in the last day of realizing that incompetence has fatal consequences. I mean, this administration stopped being funny a long, long time ago, but now it's this new level of ghoulish, ghastly realization about what we're faced with.
We in America like to poo-poo expertise sometimes.
Yeah.
Like we have this notion that the amateur is better than the expert.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in some cases that's true, but
Mm-hmm.
we're not what we're living through right now.
Yeah, I mean, why is Anthony Fauci the hero right now?
It's
Right?
called competence.
Right. But what's so interesting too is just seeing, like one of the things I really appreciate about Emilie Kornheiser is that she always thinks about the arc of a narrative, right? Like Fauci's narrative is fascinating. He was someone, when I lived in New York in the 80s, he was at the center of like incredible vitriol when the AIDS epidemic was first hitting New York. And so the fact that this man has served 5, possibly 6 presidents, he's still there, he's doing his work.
He failed in a previous pandemic. Let's not forget. I mean, the point about the vitriol during the AIDS epidemic was that he failed an entire people during a pandemic.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right.
And he learned from it, and he's understanding his role in a different way, and he has grown into that. And he's in an impossible situation where he's got to stand on this stage with somebody and figure out a way to contradict them in real time without being completely sidelined, because I think innately he understands that the states and citizens across this country need somebody to understand the systems. And he understands the systems that need to be used in order to address something like this. But so we are all flawed, right? And I think that's what people miss about the analysis that folks on the left and in the middle give to Trump and his performance, right? That it's not that we don't understand that all people are flawed and make mistakes. It's that he's completely unable to admit when he has made errors in judgment, and he'll double down on his mistakes, and that is killing people. It's literally killing people.
And when I think about what it would mean to be a part of that administration, and the complicity that you need to have in order to maintain enough of a role to serve, right? So if the idea that you're doing less harm by staying in the administration and sort of mitigating whatever harm the Trump administration is doing by sort of, being the person like who understands the public health crisis, for instance, and can be a clear voice. But the amount of how impossible it is to disagree explicitly, right? Because then you will lose your position, because that is not a tenable situation for the president, right? For someone to disagree. And so what it means to walk that line as someone who's trying to mitigate harm and being doing the best job they can, and how long a person can possibly sustain themselves doing that is really horrifying and interesting, and I think illuminates a lot of other sort of aspects of command and control politics that we have found ourselves in for decades, right?
It feels at this point in time corrosive at a very deep level.
And I think it's always been corrosive, and this is another one of those aspects of this pandemic that's really helping us see much more explicitly how corrosive or damaging so many other aspects of our system are, right?
I mean, I do think there always has been a sense that this type of politics has been corrosive. What's different is the level of distrust that Americans currently have regarding the press. And Olga, you and I have talked about this, and one day we'll do that show I want to do about that. But I think for me, that is the most terrifying, because how do we recover from that? Regardless of who is in, the Oval Office next, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, we will be paying for this lack of trust of basic facts and information and the people who deliver it. And that troubles me probably more than anything, because if essentially we have lost any sense that there is objective truth, how do we govern responsibly in the midst of that?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
because you completely lose any touchstone or common ground.
Yeah.
To at least get some footing on.
Yeah.
And the people who are navigating sort of that balance between politics and policy, right, that we're seeing play out on the national stage, don't ever have the touchstone of the truth that the media is continuing to pull the thread on, right? Because you don't ever know if the confusion that's being spoken about politically is ever going to be called out, if the media is not available for that. And it's one of the things that I've really been appreciating in Vermont through this process. We've seen really strong media presence. We see, Vermont diggers unionizing. We're seeing the Commons really, step up and mail some, and the community step up to support that, mail an issue to everyone in Windham County. That's really exciting.
Thank you.
And we're seeing a pretty decent collaboration between the administration and the legislature. Still, a little tension around who's going to lead in each situation, absolutely, and who's going to sort of, lay the truth on the line first. But it does seem that more truth is being laid on the line more regularly here, and I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading some essays yesterday from Rebecca Solnit, and one of the issues that I've been so curious about is how stories get told in the midst of crisis. And so she has a series of essays that she wrote looking at Hurricane Katrina and how it was covered at that time and what was missed. And it got me thinking about how will this story be told and what will be missed. And one of the things that gave me a lot of hope is she talked about when she first looked at how Katrina was covered and how people of color were portrayed in the media at that time and how the poor were portrayed. And she felt a hopelessness that the real story would never emerge. And one of the things that she writes about and talks about with Krista Tippett on Being, it's a great episode to listen to, is that actually people did go back and try to rectify the story of what happened. And so as much as I can feel despondent and feel like, will we ever have the truth about this pandemic, I do feel like there will always be those people out there, even after the fact, who aren't going to be ready to move on, right? I mean, I think that's the great beauty and tragedy of the American experience, which is, let's move on. Like, we're moving on, we're looking forward, the past is the past, and there is a resilience that comes from that. But as a historian myself, there is so many lessons to be learned. And so I was reflecting on that again last night. I picked up these essays again and was feeling like we won't actually know until 6 months, a year or so after we are able to come back to some semblance of, post-pandemic normalcy of interaction with each other. But it's going to be the press, and it's also going to be regular people on the ground who see themselves as reporters. And I mean reporters in the sense of documenting what's happening. And that's, going back to your question, which is, you want to feel like you're doing something, right? I feel like I look around this county, there are so many people doing things at this time, both to help their neighbors and to remember what it is this time was about.
Thank you, Becca. In my creative writing circles, more and more people are talking about journaling and how important it feels to them to kind of document and journal about this particular time. And I feel that is so important, because I agree with you, Becca, that there'll be a time where once we've caught our breath and we've had a chance to kind of process what we have experienced, that's when I think the really great insights will come.
Yeah.
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 Thank you for that. Emilie, anything you want to add before we...
No, I think that this is a really incredible extension of these conversations that we've been having. And I thank you, Becca, for adding so much to them. The idea that there are many opportunities, both for resilience and growth, and to see clearly in this moment. And one of the pieces that I think we're really trying to see clearly in this moment is how the nature of work has changed, and what that might sort of teach us about the time we're living in, as well as what opportunities for the future. And so you talked about, I'm pre-pivoting you, Olga, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
A pre-pivot, I like that.
I think that's like a very special ballet move, but I don't know the French for it. Becca, you talked about sort of how incredible it's been to see our colleagues learn how to use technology in a different way, right? That's been like astounding to me. And sometimes it makes my heart tremble a little bit to see people learn new skills that quickly and grow that fast and seem like comfortable and proud from it. It's really, and that's true in my, work at youth services, as well as in the legislature. So that's been really incredible for me. The difference in how we're both about to start voting virtually. We've had committee votes, which is essentially the same. Everyone just sort of goes around and says their name and says their vote. But the process of voting on the floor is going to change significantly, I think, as we do it virtually, especially, how cues are shared amongst us. And so I'm curious of how you're anticipating that.
How cues are shared?
Yeah, so
open that up a little bit.
So, and there are lots of similarities between the House and the Senate and how we conduct business. And one of the ways in which we are the same is that we don't get to speak on the floor of either of our chambers unless we are acknowledged by the person who is running the meeting. So in Emilie's case, it's the Speaker of the House generally, unless somebody's substituting in. And in my case, it's actually the Lieutenant Governor who presides. And so you have to stand and you have to be recognized. You don't just get to jump in. You don't just get to call something out and grab the microphone, right? And so in a chamber of 30 people, it's pretty easy to see somebody stand up and say, Mr. President, and then you have to be acknowledged. When you're on Zoom, it's hard to figure out. And oh my gosh, we spent an hour yesterday getting ready for what we're going to do this morning, which is our first time remote voting, which is, do we raise our hands? Do we actually stand up from our chair? Do we call out over the Zoom, Mr. President? Do we use, there's a function on Zoom where you can have a hand waving, like the little emoji or the thumbs up or the, get in the queue. And we had to really turn that over. What are the appropriate ways in this particular medium to retain some sense of formality? The formality is what keeps us more civil towards each other. So in the Senate, we cannot say Senator Benning or Senator Sears. We have to say the junior senator from Caledonia, or I am the junior senator from Windham County. Mm-hmm. And it gives that distance that it's not about me, the person, it's about the people I represent. I represent Windham County, I am speaking for them. And so we had to go through this whole debate about what was the most appropriate way to get attention. And so there's that level. And then there's the level of, we don't usually have any technology in the Senate chamber at all. We're not allowed to have phones, cell phones, we're not allowed to have computers. There's never been a monitor used in there, to conduct our business. And now the Lieutenant Governor is going to be looking at a screen with all of our pictures on it through Zoom, because we in the Senate decided we weren't comfortable remote voting just through audio, that we wanted people back home to be able to see each of us and our faces and see us say aye. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be interesting to see how the House is able to deal with that, because with so many more members, that gets really tricky.
So And so we're actually using voting software where we're going to have to like click in a yes or a no when we're voting, because there's no way the sort of chorus of ayes and the nuance around the chorus of ayes could carry forward on a computer.
Right.
What I'm missing and I'm curious about is that part where you think about standing up to say something, and then you look over at your colleague and you see that they're on the edge of standing up to say something, and you think, I think maybe better for that person to stand up and say something. Or they look to you and say, oh, maybe better for Senator Balint to stand up and say this. People will listen to her more. And so that side eye, that's the cue I was talking about. Or even the side eye from the speaker that like, I think maybe we should be done with this debate now, so you stay in your seat.
That's right. That's right. Yes, we talked about that actually, because the lieutenant governor was saying, well, what I'm going to do is I'll be able to see people virtually who say they have something to say, and I'll just keep a list of the order, and I'll call on these people. And another senator said, I understand why you want to do that, but that actually is not helpful because of the exact reason that Emilie just said. What if someone says something and you realize, you know what, I don't actually need to speak. They said it better than I did. And so that every time you see those people asking to speak, and for him, it's got like, every time it's got to be a clean slate. Like, do those same people still want to speak? Maybe not. Maybe the pro tem. So in our chamber, generally, if the pro tem speaks, that's the end of the discussion. You are not supposed to speak after the pro tem. They are summarizing what has been said. They're driving home the point. They're essentially calling for the vote.
And those are implicit norms. That is not like part of the official legal rules of the body. And we have the same implicit norm. Like,
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very curious. Like at 9:30, we're going to be doing this thing, and and there were still some people who couldn't figure out mute. So we'll see. We'll see what we hear.
Well, you know, this process has been really fascinating for me as someone whose job is to stand up for things like the First Amendment and open meeting and open document rules. Because one of the things I've been very impressed with is how quickly the legislature, House and Senate, have pivoted in so many ways to respond to this crisis, whether it's been the unemployment insurance, whether it's been remote voting, whatever. And that's really impressed me. But one thing because, you know, when you're a journalist, you're always just a little bit cynical. One of the things that's on my radar too is what's quote unquote normal now.
Right.
What needs to change for the time being, and what do we want to make sure doesn't come back with us on the other side of this crisis? Either things that we've been doing for years that don't need to be done, or things that have been done well that we should keep doing well, like open meetings, open documents, people's right to know, that we don't want to get scuttled in the long term.
That's right.
And so I'm curious for Becca and Emilie both, what were some of the conversations around how do we preserve the people's right to know and access while we're also trying to make sure we respond to a crisis?
Go ahead, Em. You want to start?
Oh, sure. One thing that I have really been excited by in this process is the fact that all the committee meetings are now live streamed on YouTube. So for one, I feel like I have greater access to a lot of committee meetings because I can watch them at a different time of the day rather than while I'm in committee. And so that's been incredible. And I can watch them without people knowing I'm watching them. So that's also very helpful in some ways, right? That someone can learn about an issue, be present in it with an issue, but not have other people know that they're interested in that particular issue until they're ready for people to know that they're interested in that issue. And I think that's useful for journalists and legislators and lobbyists alike. What is difficult is sort of the flip side of that, and also has a lot of opportunities. So in our committee rooms, many less people will fit in the room than might be able to watch something on YouTube. But when someone is sitting in a room present, you're aware of them being there. you're aware that they care about an issue. At least for myself, and I think for Becca, I'm very aware of like whatever energy they're throwing at me around the issue. So even though people aren't speaking, I'm often quite aware of people's perspective on a particular track of testimony. And so in some ways that's very relieving in that advocates and lobbyists are much less present in the legislative process than before. And it's troubling because I think advocates often bring a voice of a constituency that might not be as represented as it could be in the halls of government. And so that's one aspect of just even the YouTube testimony that I think has pros and cons to carry with us.
I agree. And I think what has been so clear from listening to my colleagues across the State House in both chambers is that we want to make sure that we figure this out in a way that the press absolutely has access to all the work that we're doing. And so it's an adjustment for some people who are used to being a little bit more snarky, a little bit more snide, and there's something that is lost when you're doing that in a smaller, more intimate setting of a committee room, where if somebody teases me and it might be seen as biting, but if you're in the room and you see my reaction and you know, oh, actually, this is just the relationship that I have with this other senator and it's not personal, we razz each other, that is lost on the phone. And so before we were doing Zoom, we were doing conference calls, and there were a couple times when I was contacted, because I'm the majority leader in the Senate, I was contacted by people who had been listening to the call saying, it seemed like when Senator so-and-so said that to one of the witnesses, it was disrespectful. Like, what's going on there? And so it gives you a particular window into what's happening, but as Emilie said, you miss a lot of the nuance, and you miss the gestures, and you miss the side eye kind of thing.
Emotional context.
Absolutely, emotional context and relationships, just generally relationships. And so it is going to be interesting when we emerge on the other side to go back to having us then back in these rooms, these very small little fish bowls after, a couple of my joint rules calls last week at the beginning of this crisis had hundreds of people listening in on conference call. And it was a different urgency around information. I mean, that's something else that we can talk about. What this has highlighted for me, that in those early days, people just wanted more information, period. Everything felt so out of control, just careening wildly out of control. And I realized that the best service that I could do to my constituents was just information. Whenever I had information, that was the best and most valuable commodity that I had. It wasn't even help necessarily in those early days. It was just being a conduit for information. And I think that's been a real gift for me to have that insight, is that a lot of times, even though my constituents need help from me, sometimes the very first step and what they're really looking for is just give me the information that you get to have because of where you sit that I don't have. And that's going to change the way that I do my job going forward in a really important way. That stuff that I take for granted, like, oh, nobody really needs to know about this or wants to know about this or this minute detail. And I realized, no, actually, there are people who need that information for reasons I can't even imagine, because it connects to some work that they're doing back home. And so we're all figuring this out. I was writing my column this morning, so I write a weekly column, and I was writing about the stages of competency, right? And you start from unconscious incompetence. You don't realize you're incompetent, right? Which is like listening.
Is that the same as ignorance is bliss?
Kind of, yeah, it is. And then you move from that into conscious incompetence when you realize, oh, wow, there's some stuff I really don't know, and I don't know how to do this. And then it shifts over time to this conscious competency. Like, I'm working hard and I've got it now. And I feel like we are shifting as a legislative body towards conscious competency about how to use these different tools. And then at some point, probably just about the time that the pandemic is winding down, we will get to unconscious competency, where we're just doing our work and this is feeling natural. And then we're going to have to go back to learning it all over again. And as exhausting as that is, it's also kind of exciting. I love to see how inventive people are. So
Yes.
So speaking of a place, and aware that we're running out of time, a place that I think a lot of people are feeling a great vast unknown regarding information, is folks who are in a very sort of different employment situation than those of us who are learning those new skills to do our work. And that is the 20% of working Vermonters who have applied for unemployment in the last month. And how incredibly difficult that process is. And I think that the process of applying for unemployment is arcane and confusing, even when there's only 10 claims a week, right? Like in normal times.
Every state.
In every state, yes.
In every state.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have known for the last 15 years that we need to update our Department of Labor software.
Right.
And paying for technology is expensive and incredibly unsexy thing to do. And so we have put it off for 20 years because we have limited resources. And now here we are. And what I see is a lot of incredibly scared people who have no idea if they will ever get any of the money due to them into their bank accounts.
Right. So I want to say, just because I'm conscious of the time and I have to go get ready for this other call, I want to tell you both, and after I get off, Emilie, maybe you can give Olga the details. We're actually on the Joint Rules Committee call today. We're going to have Commissioner Harrington on from Department of Labor to talk about what has gone wrong and how they're going to fix it. And so I just wanted to make sure people knew that. It's at 4:00 today. We've had about 70,000 Vermonters apply in 2 weeks. And in that time, generally, we only have 500 to 600 claims, and we've had 70,000. And so there have been things that haven't gone right because of the sheer volume, and there are other decisions that were made that didn't help that situation. So I'm going to leave you to talk about that a little bit more. I see people texting me saying, we need you to register to get on this call. So I have to go. Thank you so much for the invitation, both of you. I always love to talk to you.
Thank you, and enjoy your time in the Senate.
Joining us.
We'll see what happens. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
No, we're realigned side to side.
Yes, we are. Hello again, Emilie. If
Hello,
anyone's
Olga.
just tuning in, you are listening to the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 FM. And we were just talking with Senator Becca Balint. So, Emilie, I just received some information from the Department of Labor that for the most recent filing week, they received approximately more than 22,000 filings. This time last year, that same week, the year before, they had received just over 500. So it just kind of puts into perspective just how intense the labor force is.
To add to that perspective, there are also a lot of Vermonters that are trying to file and can't. Lots and lots and lots of Vermonters. So it's even, I think the number might even be higher than that.
So what are some of the things you're anticipating the Vermont Department of Labor needs to change or that they're working on?
So some of them are just capacity issues. So people are calling and can't get through, and they have been adding more and more and more call volume. They were basically have borrowed capacity from almost every call center in the state. EVT, Green Mountain Power, like partners you wouldn't even quite think of who happen to have sort of call center capacity because of the way they do their work, have loaned call center capacity to the Department of Labor.
Wow.
But applying for unemployment is a fairly complicated process, and so people need to be trained to support people doing that.
Yeah.
And so there's that. There's just people not being able to get through when they call. And that call volume is exacerbated by the fact that people don't understand what they're doing because there isn't clear information about the process up on the website. And that's something that state government, especially benefits eligibility, is sort of famous for, that the language is very insider rather than explicit about how this actually works and what the process looks like from an outsider to understand. And so there's that piece, and that they're working on. They're adding call center capacity, and they actually have decided to outsource all of the call center, which I have my own concerns about. So there's that piece. There's the website, which they added a sort of entry form onto to sort of just get people registered in the system. But that was so quickly added that all it does is sort of just add someone's name and social security number into the system. It doesn't start them on the benefits eligibility path. It just says, okay, we know you exist. And I think that was also very confusing for people because they didn't know what happened after they put their name in there.
Right.
There was a technological snafu, which I think a lot of people feel like is just happening to them, but is happening throughout the state around social security numbers not being recognized, which creates a like mad feedback loop that is really hard to ever pull yourself out of. There is people who were self-employed who were worried that if they didn't get their names into the system now, they would never be able to get their names into the system. And so there was a lot of people who were self-employed who were applying even before they were eligible. And so it is not entirely clear how many of those people's rejections, which sort of happen by default, are going to be able to be carried over into the new system now that those folks are eligible, or whether those folks will need to reapply. And that communication has not been shared clearly. Those are the biggest pieces. And then there's the fact that in order for someone's actual eligibility to be figured out, you need to look at past employers, you need to look at benefits history. And there's just a lot of ways for significant human error and time delay in that process, especially since so many employers have shut down their businesses temporarily. That's why we're in this situation. Those employers might not be available to answer the questions from the Department of Labor that they're being asked.
And let's also remember that on top of this, we are dealing with a population that is more stressed than usual, dealing with more uncertainty than usual, and everything's being created fresh.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is all really hard for everyone.
That is all
and it's really hard as, it's really hard to counsel someone to have patience and trust in a process that they have had no evidence in their lives to trust or be patient about. For every other benefits eligibility situation I've ever counseled anyone about, whether that was health insurance, food stamps, welfare, whatever it is, usually the advice is be persistent, keep on calling, ask to speak to a supervisor, make sure you understand all the paperwork that they have in front of you. Keep on pushing. That is not, that is just further breaking the system right now when people do that. And so we really see this balance between the needs of the individual to get immediate satisfaction for themselves and the needs of the whole for the system to work and be able to catch up with itself, because they are catching up. They genuinely are, but they're not catching up fast enough for anyone to be satisfied because everyone is scared and they don't have a paycheck.
Yeah.
And I'm just so hopeful and excited that people are going to have a paycheck, and that like the extra $600 in benefits might actually meet people's financial needs in a way that usual unemployment benefits don't. And that's one of those lessons learned, like maybe we need to up the amount of unemployment benefits that people get so that they can feel stable while they're seeking a new job or being at home. And so I'm so hopeful about like what this means for how people's needs will be met when their needs are met, and what it means about how we know we need to transform our system, that it takes a moment for me to recenter myself in the absolutely legitimate and significant fear and panic that people feel when the system isn't working right away.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the hope I have for this process is, we have people who are applying for benefits who perhaps never had to. And so we're having a segment of the population access this for the first time.
I love that part too.
I do. I think it's going to change people's empathy levels, for starters. But I think it's also going to change the system for the better in the long run, because, we've had a narrative for decades about the people who apply for welfare and why they apply and who they are and what that means about them, which has not been true on so many levels. And now we have people who maybe never had to be part of that narrative in the system, seeing how it works or doesn't. And I think that's going to change conversations and understandings for a long time.
I agree. And there are other ways that this change in how we work or don't work is going to have those ripple effects. So people who are, attempting to school their children at home, right? I've seen a lot of deep love, compassion, and appreciation for teachers who have been some of the most vilified members of our community for a while now. And so that's been amazing. And I also see this incredible appreciation for, essential personnel, essential workers, the people who are really holding our communities together, who have historically and still been paid terribly and had really stressful working conditions. And so I hope that we can move beyond the applause and gratitude to looking at workers' rights and compensation as next steps in this.
Yeah, I agree, because I think one thing this is highlighting for us, this pandemic, is, there's been a number of us who could adjust our work and work from home and do what we needed to do. But I think this is, and some of those changes may stay. We might see more remote working in the future, but I think it's also highlighting for us the jobs that can't change. Grocery stores still need to be staffed. Things still need to be transported. That's pretty much not going to change. Even if we do more things like Instacart or things like that, someone still needs to be part of that chain.
I saw a really fun meme, because we have a lot more people being creative on social media.
Yes,
lately.
we are, which I love.
I am not one of them, but I'm excited that people are. And it was really like, we have a new class divide, and it's people who are putting their lives on the line every day to go work because they have to. People who are on Zoom, and people who are unemployed. And then there's also there's the 1% who have essentially, the global 1% who have spread this disease all over the world. But
because
below that,
for travel and airplanes.
Yeah, because the global, yes, yeah. Without regard to other people's, safety or comfort. So. But below that, what we see is these really three very different places that people are operating from right now, with completely different experiences of a global crisis. And that's so interesting, because when we look at other global crises, September, 11th, which was not, or Hurricane Irene, it impacted people more similarly than I think this particular pandemic does.
Interesting. Well, yeah. Excuse me, because I can see what I think you're saying is, with this pandemic, the access to resources, whether that's a job, whether that's a computer, whether that's the internet, whether that's unemployment benefits, really makes a difference in how you weather it.
Yeah.
Where with Katrina, everybody got their windows blown in who was in the path of the hurricane.
And, everyone got trapped in their house if the road was blown out, right?
Right. Right. The access to resources came after the hurricane blew back out to sea.
Mm-hmm. But right now,
Interesting.
some of us have to work, and some of us can work, and some of us can't work.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Very good point. You know, one thing I keep sitting with, um, I'm going to go a little woo-woo for a minute. Okay, everybody, put your seatbelts on. The
it's
woo-woo
Windham
is.
County. That's what we do, Olga. Go for it.
So, as folks know, I also am a feng shui practitioner, and one thing we do in the Bagua school that I study is we do look at uh, the five elemental system, and each year has its own animal and set of elements. And the theme for the past few years, dog, pig, rat, we're now in rat, has really been about authenticity and integrity. These have been some of the themes. And being very clear about what we will and will not um, tolerate in the sense of personal behavior, but also the structures and communities that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm thinking about that right now is, you know, according to kind of that elemental philosophy, the big question has been, are you willing to tolerate any longer toxic power structures? Are you willing to hang on to systems, biases, privileges that no longer serve you or the people you love or your community as a whole? And it just feels to me like this pandemic and some of the things Becca was saying about how the federal government is really not serving the needs of the states right now,
Mm-hmm.
just feels like those issues highlighted, as if, you know, here's the big billboard, here's the toxic narcissistic structure, people.
Mm-hmm.
Is this still a corrosive system we want to hold on to?
Mm-hmm.
Do we still want to say, because, you know, what you were saying, Emilie, about working for the Trump administration, and if you are someone who's trying to balance um, towing the line so you could still do some good work, but being in a system where you can't disagree.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how many of us have worked in workplaces like that, where we have an incompetent boss or we have a cruel boss and we're just like, well, he's the boss, she's the boss,
Mm-hmm.
so I just have to put up with it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and I just feel like, or my hope for this pandemic is that more of those corrosive systems won't be able to survive. I'm
Well,
hoping they
because
go down with the
to
ship.
follow your woo-woo trail, the essence of this pandemic is that one gives up sociality in order to protect others, not to protect oneself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so it is, in some ways, the opposite of a narcissistic power structure. And at the same time, we're seeing a glorification of the command and control. We are really appreciating strong male leaders in a lot of ways, who are sort of stepping up to say what is okay and what isn't okay. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's some, you know, slightly scary tendencies in that appreciation. It's really shocking to see people appreciate Cuomo so much. I find that very, like, just
Competence is the new excellence.
yeah, and it's like, it's some pretty bare, like, it's not like really high level competence. It's like pretty
Nope.
mid level competence, you know? It's not talking about like a new vision for our communities where people's needs are met and like a, you know, a plan for that, sort of like, you know, Elizabeth Warren competence.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting how we as, you know, community members, as individuals, find ourselves when we're scared gravitating towards the leadership of others to solve problems, and how we can also see the need to be in community and care for others simultaneously, like these incredible mutual aid networks that we see cropping up, and this acknowledgement and appreciation for essential workers. And so I think those two, that balance is going to be something that we're really calling forward. And I think what you're saying about the authenticity is a really incredible tool for us to at least be naming those things when we see them.
I hope that when this immediate pandemic ends, and there will be a catch-up time afterwards where we just kind of need to resort and figure out and catch up from this time of basically shutting down. But when we're kind of feeling the ground under our feet again, I hope organizations, and I include the legislature in this, take some time to really kind of go into retreats and say, what did we learn? What worked? What do we need to let go of? And what can we change for the better to not only be resilient in a pandemic, but more resilient in everyday life? I hope we all take time to do that.
Me too. And I actually, I'm hopeful that these new technology tools that my fellow legislators have learned are going to enable us to do those kinds of retreats and conversations more easily when we're not in session, which is when the real planning work happens. And so that feels really good. Even if we can't, we've lost the opportunity to have those casual generative conversations during the session, since we're not sort of in the hallways and tables anymore. But I think we've created more capacity to have those generative conversations out of session through technology. And so I'm looking forward to starting to engage in those, and really appreciate engaging in them every other day with you lately, Olga. So thank you.
Thank you, Emilie. Same here. I appreciate our conversations because they take me out of just the crisis mode of trying to keep up with that 24/7 news cycle. Even though we're a weekly paper, we're still in that. And so thank you for giving me that space to process. I really appreciate it.
And so 2 big takeaways before we leave.
Okay.
The Department of Labor and more information coming through there. So the joint rules call, the YouTube link for that can be found on the legislature's website under the Joint Rules Committee, which is under Joint Committees. And that's at 4:00 today. And then Senator Balint writes up a summary of every single joint rules call when it's over and posts that on social media and shares it more broadly if people want to read about that. So really want to make sure people are aware of that, and then aware of just that you can watch any committee hearing anytime you want. I recommend doing it in the background rather than the foreground, but it is, it's very interesting.
Yes, it is. Well, Emilie, thank you for a fantastic conversation today.
Thank you.
And we will be back. This is, of course, the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 FM. We air on 2 p.m. on the radio station, as well as YouTube and SoundCloud. Emilie, where can people find you if they need to?
EmilieKornheiser.org, ekornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us, ekornheiser@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And every Saturday morning at 9 a.m., I am hosting a Zoom coffee hour with Representatives Tolino and Burke to talk about whatever people want to talk about that week.
Thank you. Well, everyone, have a great weekend, and we will see you next week.